black and white. It's all here in this book. Do as we tell you, don't step out of line. No need to take your own look. Don't you know the devil is out to get you? Child, he's on a roll. If you think for yourself, you might make a mistake, and he'll come and steal your sinning soul. But I found God is in the grave. God is in the grave. And in all the colors we see every day, God is in the grave. They were preoccupied with saving souls as kids were left hung out to dry, scared and confused, standing accused, no matter how hard we tried. I know they were just doing their believing best to ensure we'd make St. Peter's cut, but all we really wanted was to feel safe and loved, no matter what. We found God is in the grave. God is in the grave. And the way we love each other every day, God is in the grave. Oh, disenchanted true believers, it's time we let it go. We're finding our own way up the mountain. What kind of seeds will we choose to sow as we go? It's in the potter's hand, shaping the clay, in the laughter of the children at play, in all the searching we do every day, in any language we might choose to pray, calling out Yahweh. God is in the grave.
There was a time not too long ago when I was almost no longer a monoglot. Like approximately 80% of people in the United States, I learned to speak only one language as a child. My public education gave me the opportunity to pretend to learn French, but honesty compels me to admit that what I really learned was how to use a bilingual dictionary and grammar book. Those are helpful skills, and I can still pretend to read a little French or sound out Hebrew from my courses in college. My travels have empowered me to repeat an odd phrase in Russian, Indonesian, or Spanish. But it wasn't until living in Cambodia that I actually began to speak another language. Unfortunately, I haven't had the opportunity to immerse myself in Cambodian culture here in Southwest Missouri, and 7 years of speaking Khmer only when Holly and I want to share a private conversation in public hasn't kept my language skills sharp. I am sadly, functionally, a monoglot again. For those of us who learn languages late in life, I think it's a common experience. It's easier to forget than it is to remember. Fluency eludes us. We translate in our heads more than are able to speak from our hearts. Language and culture cannot be separated, which is what makes translation such a challenging and beautiful art, and what makes Google Translate such a wonderful and dangerous convenience. Religion is wrapped up in all of this too. For most Americans, even non-religious ones, we can't escape picking up the cultural baggage of Western religion, any more than a child can escape picking up vocabulary from the television. So what is it that we have actually learned? What religious language do we speak? If we return to an insight made by the feminist and liberation theologian Dorothy Zolle in 1984, we can group our religious expressions into two main categories, what she called the double function of religion, as apology and legitimation of the status quo and its culture of injustice on the one hand, and as a means of protest, change, and liberation on the other hand. Transcending denomination and sect, it's clear that religion has functioned for most people in the United States to legitimize an unjust status quo. That's why we can see photos of earnest sycophants laying hands on presidents, praying for God's blessing, why we have national prayer breakfasts, and even why we have bizarre versions of history that insist that a place like the United States has been and should be a haven for a particular brand of evangelical piety. This week, it's why we could hear Robert Jeffress, a senior pastor at First Baptist Church of Dallas, revel in the possibility of war when he said, quote, "When it comes to how we should deal with evildoers, the Bible in the book of Romans is very clear. God has endowed rulers," and remember, in this case, he's talking about Donald Trump, has endowed rulers full power to use whatever means necessary, including war, to stop evil. That gives the government the authority to do whatever, whether it's assassination, capital punishment, or evil punishment to quell the actions of evildoers like Kim Jong-un. It's also why we can hear voices like Franklin Graham, who proudly announced last November that many thought the Trump-Pence ticket didn't have a chance. None of them understand the God factor. Whoa. While the media scratches their heads and tries to understand how this happened, I believe that God's hand intervened. But as Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II astutely observed, God did not intervene on Trump's behalf in this year's election. The Billy Graham Evangelistic Association did. Organizing prayer rallies in all 50 state capitals, Franklin Graham spent $10 million in 2016 to rally a backlash against President Obama in God's name. It was a strategic investment. 81% of evangelicals voted for Trump. If that's not a good definition of legitimation, I don't know what is. Legitimation works on two levels. First, people become convinced that they should or have to submit to the powers that be and the way things are, often because God ordained it to be so or because it can't be any other way. This can be accomplished in several ways. It may come under the guise of an elusive hope, such as the American dream or a dream to make America great again, keeping us tolerant of injustice while ever hopefully reaching for a life that's just out of reach for most. It may come with the weight of tradition and legality, such as the unthinking acceptance of slavery, then Jim Crow laws and segregation, and then today's mass incarceration, each stubbornly resistant to change and borne along by the steady arms of custom. It may also come through despair, to the resigned acquiescence to a hopeless situation. Those in power, they don't care so much whether you love them or hate them. They care whether you will submit. What if you don't submit? That's where the second level comes into play. The powers that be are justified in their use of coercion and violence against anyone they think threatens their power. Just think about the rationalizations and celebrations of police brutality we see on social media. Just think about the rants and violence against justice movements like No DAPL and Black Lives Matter. Just think about the public outrage over thoughtful and powerful actions like people like Colin Kaepernick. As Harry Belafonte has put it, and I think people from marginalized communities will recognize this statement, when a black voice is raised in protest to oppression, those who are comfortable with our oppression are the first to criticize us for daring to speak out against it. I would guess most of us are familiar with how the religious language of legitimation is filled with a vocabulary of domination, fear, blame, and guilt. These are words and images that are meant to keep us in line, to make us obey. We might not notice that in learning how to submit to an authoritarian, coercive, violent God, we conveniently learn to submit, for example, to an authoritarian, coercive, violent economic system. Isn't it interesting that the same mixture of benevolent goodness and terrifying violence characterizes so many aspects of our culture? We learn that God loves us and offers us bliss in heaven, but is also willing to torture us in hell, and not just for a little while, if we don't comply with patriarchal social norms. We also learn that the rich and powerful are wonderful examples, that we should aspire to their lifestyles, appreciate them, love them, even while the poor are worked or starved to death or abandoned in despair. We dare not upset our masters. Doing so would risk misery, rejection, loneliness, death, hell. So the masters mix in just enough sentiment, just enough promises of pie in the sky, just enough conveniences, just enough hope that we might become one of the lucky ones that rises to the top, that we lower our heads and submit. This is the religious language of the community in which I was raised. But I also heard in echoes and whispers another language, that of protest, change, and liberation. Liberation also works on two levels, flipping the script from domination to liberation, from exploitation to partnership. In refusing to submit in the face of coercion and violence, liberation insists that the way things are isn't inevitable. It shows the gaps in the armor, the holes in the wall. Oppressive systems are also counting on people being unwilling to risk losing what privileges they have, what conveniences they have. So one part of liberation is finding ways, little and large, to resist, oppose, engage. We rebel. Amen. But this is only one part. We must also announce and embody a different way. In her autobiography, longtime activist Grace Lee Boggs beautifully expressed this. She wrote, "Rebellion is a stage in the development of revolution, but it is not revolution. It's an important stage because it represents the standing up of the oppressed. Rebellions break the threads that have been holding the system together and throw into question the legitimacy and the supposed permanence of existing institutions. A rebellion disrupts the society, but it does not have what is necessary to make a revolution, to establish a new social order. To make a revolution, people must not only struggle against existing institutions, they must make a philosophical, spiritual leap and become more human beings. In order to change and transform the world, they change and transform themselves." This is why the most urgent task for religious communities today, the most urgent task for spiritual reformation, relate to how we, one, support and disrupting and subverting oppressive systems, while we, two, provide practices, resources, and communities where we can become more human beings. Each day as I sit down to meditate, I get in touch with my intentions. What kind of human being am I going to be? How am I going to relate to my experiences? What world am I helping to create? As I settle into the silence, I bring my attention to the qualities that I believe can thrive in and support a sustainable, just society: gratitude, kindness, curiosity, simplicity, wisdom. There's plenty of room in this silence for my anger and my grief, because I know that those things help carry me forward. But we're not doing this work so that we can always be angry. We're doing this work so that we can create a world where we don't have to be afraid, where we don't have to be worried, where we don't have to be full of rage over the looming possibility of police brutality, over losing our health care, over being forced to choose between buying groceries or paying rent, over facing discrimination for disabilities or chronic illness, over being bullied for our gender or sexuality. It is certain that we need the rebellion to disrupt and subvert and overturn these systems, but we need the rebellion for the sake of the revolution. Our rage reminds us that we are human beings, and I'm grateful for the rage because it helps me find my home, reminds me of my place in this journey of becoming a more human being. Amen. We have a rich history to draw upon for this journey. Heretics, radicals, mendicants, prophets, solitaries, communitarians, rebels, prisoners, martyrs, scholars, lovers, parents, children, and sometimes preachers. We should study this history from ancient memories to today's tweets and become familiar with how we have rebelled, how we have embodied equality and community, what worked and why, what failed and why, and how we went about it. These histories extend across sects, denominations, traditions, or other religious and sociological divisions. And we should pay attention to this because what matters most to me is what religious or cultural language we are speaking. Is it legitimation or is it liberation? I can and do work alongside people who differ from me in background or creed as long as we are united around liberation. This is the difference that matters. I can and do work alongside people who differ from me in background or creed as long as we are united around liberation. This is the difference that matters. Yeah. I began this reflection talking about my disappointment with being a monoglot again, how it's easier to forget than remember a new language, how we translate in our heads more than speak from our hearts. I think it's an apt metaphor for those of us who grew up speaking exclusively or primarily the religious language of legitimation. I could not become fluent in French simply by learning how to use a dictionary and grammar book, and I only became conversational in Khmer by immersing myself in Cambodian culture. I had to learn how to get my moto tire repaired, how to buy food at a roadside stall, how to listen to families as they spoke about conflict and stressors in their lives. It's hard work, and you have to be willing to be a learner. You have to be willing to take a back seat to those who already know how to speak. You have to be willing to make mistakes and be corrected and laughed at sometimes when you do practice conversation. I think all those lessons apply directly to us if we're learning to speak the religious language of liberation. We have to be willing to be a learner. We have to be willing to take back seats to those who already know how to speak. We have to be willing to make mistakes and be corrected when we do practice. I mention this because it's typical, as Roger was saying earlier in the conference, for us to have this ongoing conversation about what to do next as progressive religious folks. When this is about reflexive practice, when it's about stepping back and learning, making adjustments, and planning strategically, forcing ourselves to think about what we're doing, these are the right questions to ask. But too many times we end up talking about the problems without acting in a meaningful way. And I think this kind of helplessness can be a dialect of legitimation. It keeps us frozen and never a threat to the status quo. Meanwhile, people who do speak the language of liberation, they're already doing the work, and they have been doing the work for a long time. At this point, if we don't know what to do, we might consider that it could be because we've not been listening, or that we haven't yet learned the language that liberation is speaking. And if that's the case, the next step is to take those language lessons, to be willing to be a learner, to take a back seat, to make mistakes and be corrected, and keep learning. In whatever ways work best for you, learn from those already practicing this language of protest, change, and liberation. If you've heard me speak before, you probably know I became sensitive to oppression in my community, family, and life at an early age. The stories and teachings of Jesus and the prophets helped make that a positive thing. I was very angry, but I also had a clear sense of justice and solidarity and with the oppressed throughout history. And yet, I was so deeply embedded in the Southern Baptist culture of my childhood, I wasn't able to step away from that denomination until 2007. 30 years. To anyone hearing my words who is under the weight of that struggle, who still suffers the wounds of it, please do not give up in seeking the encouragement, friendships, resources, and healing that you need. Because when it comes to spiritual reformation, we always need to mean it, and we always need every one of us together to become more human beings. I want to close these reflections by turning our attention to the University of Virginia, a protest, the Unite the Right March, and the violence that's unfolded there. Yesterday, Tracy Prince Deson posted to social media a story from Charlottesville. Across the street from the University of Virginia campus, people were meeting at a church in a rally to support racial justice. The service ended just as the white nationalists were carrying their torches through the streets. And he wrote this: "At this time, the rally was heading across the street from the church, literally, and a group of anti-fascists were now head-to-head. At this point, I'm receiving word that there was an encounter. A trans woman of color was sprayed with chemical agents. People stayed inside the church. I hear the call for a medic on the phone, so I yelled for one inside the church, literally across the street where people were being hurt. One finally responded. By this point, the front doors of the church are locked, and they're funneling everyone out the side of the church or the back. Just know that when people of color and black people were literally screaming for help, screaming for bodies to come surround them, this church, filled with allies, did nothing. It wasn't until after the encounter that I guess someone deemed it safe enough to start running water at, and even then it was me, a black queer, along with other black women and a black man running the water out. Black people running out to support black and brown people who were just surrounded and attacked. White allies avoided it in its entirety. Allies did nothing until it was safe enough. The church's doors were locked." I hope those words can sink deep within us. This is the frustration and the insight of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. with the white moderate, who he called the great stumbling block and the stride toward freedom. And it's a perfect example of King's criticism that the religious community is largely adjusted to the status quo, standing as a taillight behind other community agencies rather than as a headlight leading humanity to higher levels of justice. The events in Charlottesville are another reminder of what the status quo really means and stands for. It stands in a long list of reminders written through every day of our history, every community, every heart. Each Sunday, we meet under a banner that proclaims we shall not stand idly by, and yet, how often can we find ourselves in these words? Allies did nothing until it was safe enough. The church's doors were locked. Wow. It's an illusion that we can be innocent bystanders. In another social media post attributed only to a comrade, they wrote, "They openly organized," speaking of the fascists, the neo-Nazis in Virginia, "they openly organized violence and do so with the blessing of the cops. After I pulled a woman out of the road, we chased after the Mustang and it sped down the mall. I came across a group of cops standing around joking and screamed at them to call an ambulance. They just laughed at me. Medics in the peaceful demonstration were trying desperately to treat the 15-plus injured people for almost 5 minutes before any of the police did anything. The street was littered with blood and mangled bodies, people screaming everywhere for help. This is not an aberration. This is the logical conclusion of white supremacist ideology. Just a couple of hours after witnessing this terrorist attack, all I can say is that you're with us or against us. Stand with colonized people defending themselves from violent white supremacists, or get out of the way." These are the two languages in stark contrast. This is not an aberration. This is the logical conclusion of white supremacist ideology. We'll be learning more in the days ahead how we can stand with Charlottesville against white supremacy. For those of us who are here in Springfield, there'll be a rally in solidarity with the victims of fascism in Charlottesville tonight at 6 p.m. at City Hall. And we'll have more opportunities at work and school to counter defenses of white nationalism and conversation. We'll have the opportunity to donate money. We'll have plenty of opportunities, and we'll also have plenty of temptations to lock the doors and stay safe. As King wrote, though, there will not be a more convenient season. Legitimation cautions us, tells us to lock the doors and take care of ourselves. Liberation invites us. Stand with colonized people or get out of the way. So let's keep the doors unlocked and stand together. Amen.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.